The most celebrated virtue in society is not virtue at all, but the most insidious form of bondage. What you call consideration for others, that ceaseless accommodation of your nature to their expectations, represents not moral refinement, but metaphysical error of the gravest sort. The man praised as diplomatic, mature, and socially accomplished is precisely the man who has sacrificed his existence to purchase approval from those who possess neither wisdom to grant it nor permanence to sustain it. I discovered this truth during my years of academic obscurity, when colleagues who contorted their philosophy to please prevailing fashion received professorships while I lectured to empty halls. Yet observe, their names are forgotten dust, while my work endures. They traded authenticity for temporal approval and received neither lasting recognition nor genuine existence. I refused all accommodation to fashionable delusion and gained both philosophical truth and, eventually, its acknowledgement. The paradox resolves thus: the very act of seeking universal approval guarantees universal enslavement, while relinquishing this pursuit opens the sole path to liberation, not from suffering, for the will ensures that remains constant, but from the peculiar torture of existing as a mere reflection of others' desires. This transformation changes not merely your social strategy, but your metaphysical relationship to existence itself. Most men live their entire lives enslaved without ever perceiving their bondage. They mistake their chains for ornaments, their prison for home. The compulsion to please others, this ceaseless, exhausting performance wherein you contort your genuine nature to match imagined expectations, is not the social virtue you believe it to be. It is servitude of the most thorough kind. I witnessed this clearly during my years in Berlin, where I attempted the foolish enterprise of university lecturing, a colleague of considerable natural ability, suppressed every genuine philosophical insight to align with Hegelian orthodoxy, that fashionable charlatan whose obscure nonsense dominated German academia. My colleague received his professorship, advanced through the ranks, published well-received books, and died forgotten. His works gathered dust in libraries no one enters. Why? Because he served approval rather than truth, and approval dies with the approvers. Meanwhile, I published truths that please no one. My lecture hall remained empty while Hegel's overflowed with students eager to hear comfortable delusions. Yet who is read today? This is not vanity speaking, it is recognition that truth possesses value independent of temporal approval. Your people-pleasing springs from the same blind force that drives the stag to battle for dominance and the peacock to display its plumage. The will to live operates through you, exploiting your capacity for representation to bind you more thoroughly to its service. The animal seeks approval for immediate biological ends. You, cursed with reason, extend this seeking into infinite regression. You seek approval not merely for survival, but for your opinions, your taste, your very manner of seeking approval itself. Society inverts reality with diabolical cleverness. The approval seeker receives praise for diplomacy, consideration, maturity. The one who resists, who insists on his own perception, regardless of censure, faces condemnation as difficult, selfish, immature. The chains are reinforced precisely when they should be questioned. What you call virtue is bondage. What you call selfishness may be the beginning of wisdom. Count the actual advantages you have received from contorting your nature to please others. Now count the cost, the genuine thoughts unexpressed, the opportunities forsaken, the slow erosion of your capacity to even recognize your authentic response to existence. The ledger balances overwhelmingly toward devastating loss. You seek approval because you have confused what you are with how you appear in others' minds. This represents catastrophic misunderstanding of reality's fundamental structure. When I published my magnum opus at 30 years of age, it met with complete indifference. Not a single reviewer of significance acknowledged it. No professor recommended it to students. The reading public ignored it entirely. I faced a choice that proved decisive: revise the work to suit prevailing tastes, or recognize that its truth value existed independently of any reader's opinion. This seems obvious, does it not? Yet observe how few genuinely comprehend it. My philosophy was either true or false, regardless of whether Herr Professor X approved, regardless of whether the book sold a single copy at the Leipzig Book Fair. The work's relationship to reality, its correspondence to the actual nature of existence, operated in an entirely different domain than the question of social reception. What you are, your essential. Nature is temporary manifestation of the universal will. What appears in others' minds is mere representation, a phenomenal image governed by the principle of sufficient reason operating through space, time, and causality. These others judge an appearance, not the thing in itself. Their approval cannot touch what you actually are any more than a man's shadow can alter the man. Consider the structure of your anxiety when facing potential criticism. You fear not the actual judgment, for that is merely words, sounds in air, marks on paper. You fear your representation of their judgment, your imagination of how you will appear in their mental theater. But their minds contain not you, but their representation of you, filtered through their particular prejudices, limitations, and will-determined perspectives. The Hindu sages understood this with clarity. Western philosophy still struggles to match. Maya, the cosmic illusion, operates precisely here. The entire drama of separate individuals judging each other, seeking validation from one another, exists in the realm of phenomenal appearance only. At the deepest level, there is only will, temporarily objectified through countless individual forms. When you grasp this distinction, truly grasp it, not merely understand it intellectually, the approval-seeking compulsion loses its foundation. If others judge only your phenomenal appearance while your essential nature remains untouched, what exactly is at stake in their judgment? The answer? Nothing of genuine consequence. Everything of temporary, illusory consequence. Those whose approval you desperately seek are themselves blind, driven creatures. Their judgments emerge not from clear perception of reality, but from unexamined assumptions, inherited prejudices, and will-determined perspectives that they mistake for rational assessment. Walk through Frankfurt streets and observe the burghers conducting their commerce, the clerks hurrying to their posts, the professors delivering their lectures. Each harbors opinions about countless matters: philosophy, politics, art, morality, proper conduct. Ask yourself, from whence do these opinions derive? Not from careful investigation of truth, but rather from a concatenation of accidents. This man believes as he does because he was born in Hamburg rather than Vienna, because his father held these views, because his social position demands this stance, because his temperament inclines him toward that conclusion. When such a person judges you, what exactly is doing the judging? Not lucid reason contemplating truth with dispassionate clarity. Rather, you are being assessed by a composite of circumstances over which this individual exercised no control and which he has never thought to examine. I watched students flood to Hegel's lectures while my own hall remained empty. Did their choice reveal anything about the truth value of our respective philosophies? It revealed only that Hegel told them what they wished to hear, that history progresses toward rational perfection, that their comfortable bourgeois existence represented human development's apex, that reason governs reality according to benevolent purpose. I offered less palatable truth, that existence is suffering, that the will underlying reality is blind and purposeless, that their lives signified nothing beyond temporary objectifications of this meaningless striving. Which message would you expect to fill lecture halls? The comfortable delusion or the uncomfortable truth? Popularity correlates inversely with truth. In my experience, what pleases the multitude is usually delusion. What disturbs them is often reality. Before granting weight to any judgment, examine its source. What are this person's demonstrated values? What governs their assessments? You will typically discover that their judgment emerges from perspective fundamentally different from yours, neither absolutely right nor absolutely wrong, but will-determined rather than truth-directed. They cannot see clearly because they do not seek to see clearly. They seek validation of their existing prejudices. The projection principle operates with perfect consistency. The insecure man condemns confidence as arrogance. The conformist attacks originality as eccentricity. Learn to read criticism as revelation of the critic rather than assessment of you. Their judgment discloses their limitations, not your deficiencies. At the deepest level of reality, there exists only one. Will a blind, purposeless, universal force of endless striving, manifesting temporarily through countless individual forms. What you take as separate individuals judging each other are actually the same underlying reality responding to itself, like waves upon the ocean surface believing themselves independent entities. During my studies of the Upanishads, those ancient Hindu texts which contain more genuine wisdom than all of European philosophy combined, I encountered the profound teaching, Ted Devam Asi, that thou art. The seemingly separate other is ultimately yourself. This seemed abstract philosophy until direct observation confirmed its truth. I once witnessed two men arguing violently in Frankfurt's marketplace over some trivial commercial dispute. Each believed himself defending truth and justice. Each felt righteous indignation. Each was utterly convinced of his position's correctness and his opponent's error. Yet I perceived clearly the same will manifesting through two temporary forms, quarreling with itself, blind to its fundamental unity. This is not poetic metaphor, but metaphysical fact. The principle of individuation operating through space, time, and causality creates the appearance of separate entities. But this appearance is phenomenal only, not noumenal reality. Just as countless waves are all the same ocean temporarily formed into different shapes, so all individual consciousnesses are the one will temporarily objectified through the conditions of phenomenal existence. When you seek another's approval, you implicitly accept the reality of separation, the illusion that this other person possesses something you lack, that their validation can complete you, that their judgment pertains to your actual nature. Yet if my metaphysics is correct, and I stake everything upon this foundation, then at the deepest level, you seek approval from what is ultimately yourself. This is as meaningless as your left hand seeking your right hand's validation. Understanding this intellectually differs vastly from grasping it experientially. The intellectual comprehension leaves behavior largely unchanged. The experiential recognition transforms spontaneously. When you perceive directly, even for a moment, that the one whose approval you seek is not fundamentally separate from you, the entire motivation structure underlying approval-seeking collapses. This recognition generates genuine compassion as well, though not in the sentimental sense that moralists preach. If all beings are manifestations of the same will, then another's suffering is your suffering, their striving is your striving. Compassion arises not as moral duty imposed from without, but as simple recognition of reality. The acknowledgement that harming another is ultimately harming oneself, that the boundaries between individuals prove illusory upon metaphysical examination. Humans alone among animals possess the peculiar capacity for representation, the ability to hold images, concepts, and judgments in consciousness far beyond the immediate perceptual present. This gift becomes a curse more devastating than any physical change. While animals respond only to present stimuli, you respond to imagined futures, remembered pasts, and most devastatingly, to your representations of others' representations of you. I observed a young scholar agonizing for weeks before submitting a philosophical paper, certain the reviewers would dismiss his work with harsh criticism. He represented to himself their anticipated scorn in such vivid detail that he suffered authentically from purely imagined judgment. When the acceptance arrived with minor revisions only, he was astonished. The devastating criticism existed entirely within his own consciousness, nowhere else. This is humanity's peculiar suffering. We experience pain not merely from what actually occurs, but from what we represent to ourselves might occur, could have occurred, or exists in others' minds. The deer flees the wolf's teeth, You flee your imagination of disapproval that may never materialize. Consider the structure of your approval-seeking anxiety more carefully. How much pertains to actual present circumstances versus represented possibilities? You sit alone in your room, yet anxiety about tomorrow's social encounter grips you. Nothing threatens you in this present. The moment the room is quiet, your needs are met, no actual danger exists. Yet you suffer because you represent to yourself possible disapproval, imagine others' judgments, construct elaborate scenarios of rejection. The suffering is real, I do not discount this, but recognize its source. Not external reality, but your own capacity for representation operating without restraint. My poodle Atma experiences present pleasure or displeasure, but cannot torture himself with representations of future judgment or past humiliation. His consciousness, limited though it is, remains freer than yours precisely through this limitation. You possess greater capacity for wisdom than any animal, but also greater capacity for self-inflicted suffering. The same faculty that enables philosophical insight enables endless rumination about others' opinions. The same ability to represent abstract truth enables you to represent imagined criticism until it becomes more vivid than actual experience. The solution is not to eliminate representation. This is impossible without destroying human consciousness itself. Rather, you must develop conscious relationship to representation, recognizing it as representation rather than mistaking it for reality. When anxiety about others' judgment arises, practice distinguishing what am I actually experiencing in this present moment versus what am I representing to myself about possible futures or others' minds. This practice does not eliminate suffering, but reveals how much of it you generate unnecessarily through representations divorced from present reality. In genuine aesthetic contemplation, when you lose yourself completely in a landscape, a musical composition, a work of genuine art, something profound occurs. The will momentarily releases its grip on consciousness. You cease being the needy ego seeking validation and become instead the pure, will-less subject of knowing. During particularly difficult years when my philosophical work meant nothing but indifference, and my lectures attracted no students, I found refuge in Frankfurt's concert halls. When absorbed completely in a Mozart symphony or a Bach fugue, the question of professional approval simply ceased to exist, not through denial or suppression, but through actual transformation of consciousness itself. I was no longer Arthur Schopenhauer, the failed lecturer requiring validation, but pure contemplating awareness, encountering beauty directly. In these moments, others' opinions literally cannot touch you because the you that would be affected has temporarily dissolved. The individual will, that manifestation of the universal will, through your particular form, becomes quiescent. What remains is consciousness operating without desire, perceiving without willing, existing without the constant striving that characterizes ordinary experience. This is not escape from reality, but the truest engagement with it. In will-less aesthetic absorption, you perceive the Platonic ideas, the eternal archetypes that exist between the blind will and the phenomenal world of individual objects. You glimpse existence freed from the will's distorting influence, see beauty as it is, rather than in relation to your desires or needs. I play my wooden flute each morning without fail. I attend concerts weekly when opportunity permits. I spend hours in galleries before paintings that move me. These are not leisure activities or cultural refinement. They are spiritual disciplines, training consciousness to inhabit states where the will-driven ego dissolves temporarily. Natural beauty offers perhaps the most accessible path because it requires no education to appreciate. The Rhine Valley landscape, alpine peaks visible in clear weather, even Frankfurt's modest gardens provide entry to will-less perception available to all regardless of learning. Stand before a magnificent tree and give it your complete attention. Let your consciousness merge with the perception until self-consciousness disappears, until you forget entirely about what anyone thinks of you, until the usual churning of desire and anxiety simply stops. You know you have achieved genuine aesthetic absorption when time becomes meaningless, when you lose awareness of yourself as separate observer, when approval-seeking concerns cannot arise because the structure they require, the needy ego, has temporarily vanished. Regular aesthetic practice gradually transforms your general relationship to consciousness. The capacity to enter will-less states becomes more accessible. The will's constant grip loosens incrementally. This does not solve the practical problems of life, but it provides both temporary respite and proof that liberation from the will-driven ego is actually possible. You have rationalized your approval-seeking as pragmatic strategy. It maintains harmony. You tell yourself, it advances my interests. It enables necessary cooperation. These are lies, transparent upon ruthless examination. A Frankfurt merchant of my acquaintance regularly suppressed his innovative business ideas to align with his partner's conservative preferences. He believed this self-censorship purchased harmony and security. When disputes arose anyway over unrelated matters, he discovered his accommodation had purchased nothing, no protection, no goodwill, no advantage. Worse still, his surrendered innovations eventually appeared in a competitor's successful operation. He had sacrificed authentic contribution for imaginary security that never materialized. Now conduct this same ruthless accounting for yourself. Document comprehensively every instance where you modified your authentic response to please others. For each, note precisely, what did I gain? What did I sacrifice? What consequence did I fear? Did that feared consequence actually occur? The ledger will reveal catastrophic imbalance, enormous cost paid for negligible or wholly imaginary gains. You suppressed genuine insights that might have proved valuable. You forsook opportunities that might have advanced your actual interests. You progressively lost the capacity to even recognize your authentic response to situation. And what did you purchase with these sacrifices? Usually nothing. Occasionally temporary approval that evaporated at the first moment your interests conflicted with the others. People-pleasing does not maintain harmony. It maintains the appearance of harmony while generating profound internal discord. True harmony emerges from authentic engagement between individuals who respect each other sufficiently to speak truth. The harmony purchased through perpetual self-suppression is false, unstable, ultimately more costly than honest conflict would have been. You believe approval-seeking protects you from rejection and conflict. Examine this belief carefully. In truth, people-pleasing guarantees both absolute rejection of your authentic self by yourself and inevitable conflict when suppressed authenticity eventually erupts or when your accommodations fail to prevent the disapproval you feared anyway. I conducted this very experiment during my Berlin years. In some contexts, I accommodated academic fashion. In others, I insisted on my genuine philosophical positions regardless of consequences. The accommodations purchased nothing. Those who had the power to advance my career were not swayed by my diplomatic adjustments. Meanwhile, my insistence on uncomfortable truths, though professionally costly in the short term, ultimately proved the only path to work of lasting value. The evidence demonstrates conclusively your people-pleasing serves you not at all. This recognition, uncomfortable though it is, proves essential. Only by seeing clearly what approval-seeking costs and fails to deliver can you genuinely relinquish it rather than merely suppressing it temporarily through willpower. You seek approval to validate a stable, autonomous self that you believe exists beneath your social mask. This represents the cruelest illusion. The self you wish others to validate is itself a representation, another phenomenal appearance lacking the substantial essence you imagine it possesses. After decades of seeking validation for my philosophical identity, that Arthur Schopenhauer was a significant thinker, deserving academic recognition, I undertook a rigorous examination. Who exactly is this Arthur Schopenhauer requiring validation? I investigated my own consciousness with the same scrutiny I applied to philosophical problems. What did I discover? Memories of past events, constantly shifting and unreliable. Current sensations in this body, changing moment to moment. Thoughts arising and dissolving unbidden. Emotions fluctuating according to circumstances and digestion. Future projections, pure imagination. Where in all this flux was the fixed substantial self whose worth the Berlin professors could confirm or deny? There was will, manifesting through this particular form temporarily, governed by this particular character, but no enduring essence, no autonomous entity whose value could be either validated or invalidated by others' judgments. The self I had defended so desperately proved remarkably difficult to actually locate upon examination. Try this investigation yourself. What exactly is this self whose worth you seek to validate? Attempt to specify it precisely. You will find yourself grasping at constantly shifting phenomena, none substantial, none permanent, none constituting a fixed identity that could be accurately judged by another. You have a character, the particular constellation of tendencies through which will manifests in your case, but you are not reducible to this character. Your essential nature transcends any particular characteristics others might judge. They assess phenomena. They cannot touch noumena, the thing in itself that you fundamentally are. Even if others approved of you perfectly, they would approve of their mental representation of you, not you as you actually are. Their approval validates their image, not your being. You seek validation for something that cannot be validated because it is not what you imagine it to be. This recognition proves profoundly liberating once genuinely grasped. The desperate quality of approval-seeking diminishes when you recognize there exists no substantial self whose very existence depends on validation. You still may desire approval at times. This is natural, but the desperation lessens. This creates crucial breathing room between stimulus and response, between potential disapproval and your anxiety about it. You begin relating to yourself more lightly, with less clinging to its validation or defense, not because you have become callous or indifferent, but because you recognize that what you took as solid, permanent identity is actually fluid process, temporary phenomenon, ultimately empty of the inherent essence you imagined required, protecting. You believe your suffering from lack of approval evidences your particular inadequacy or unique social failure. This represents profound misunderstanding of existence's fundamental nature. Walking Frankfurt streets, I observe countless faces bearing marks of suffering, not from poverty or disease, but from the universal dissatisfaction intrinsic to will-driven existence. The successful merchant worries ceaselessly about maintaining his success. The failed merchant grieves his failure with equal intensity. The unmarried woman fears eternal solitude. The married woman endures marital constraints. Each believes their particular suffering is a unique problem requiring specific solution. All fail to recognize they witness the same mechanism, the will's blind, insatiable striving manifesting through different circumstances. Your approval-seeking is not personal defect, but universal condition, one manifestation of the desire that can never achieve permanent satisfaction, because it emerges from the will's fundamental nature, not from particular circumstances that could be remedied. The merchant who sneers at your unconventional opinion suffers from his own bondage to social convention. The academic who dismisses your insight suffers from his narrow paradigm's constraints. The family member who demands your conformity suffers from desperate need to validate their own choices by securing your agreement. Their judgment emerges from their suffering, not from superior position that could legitimately assess you. When you recognize that all beings enslaved to will experience insatiable desire and consequent suffering, that everyone seeking approval is simultaneously unable to genuinely grant it because they themselves lack what they seek. The imagined power differential collapses. You are not subordinate petitioner before superior judge. You are fellow sufferer encountering fellow sufferer, both trapped in the same condition, neither possessing validation, both seek. This recognition generates genuine compassion, though not the sentimental variety that moralists preach. True compassion, what Buddha termed karuna, arises from recognizing shared nature and shared suffering. It is not emotional indulgence, but clear perception of reality. You cannot feel superior to those whose approval you sought when you recognize they suffer as you do, trapped in the same mechanism, victims of the same blind will operating through all existence. Paradoxically, Embracing the reality that suffering is universal and inevitable rather than personal failure proves liberating. You cease seeking solutions that cannot exist. Permanent satisfaction through approval is impossible because the will's nature is endless striving. Recognizing this, you stop demanding the impossible and instead undertake the difficult but possible task. Loosening the will's grip through philosophical understanding and aesthetic contemplation, not seeking satisfaction it demands but cannot achieve. The individual who has achieved substantial liberation from approval seeking speaks with a directness that most find disturbing. When controversial opinion emerges in conversation, he states his view without hedging, without monitoring others' reactions for signs of approval or disapproval. He neither retreats under disagreement nor becomes combative under challenge. At the few Frankfurt gatherings I attend, I express my philosophical positions without accommodation to prevailing sentiment. When fashionable opinion venerates Hegel, I call him precisely what he is: a charlatan whose deliberately obscure nonsense has poisoned German philosophy. When someone praises marriage's supposed joys, I enumerate instead its manifold sufferings with clinical precision. When optimists celebrate human progress, I cite the perpetual miseries that constitute existence across all eras. The result? I am deemed difficult, misanthropic, unpleasant company. Society would much prefer I pretend agreement with comfortable delusions. Yet I sleep soundly each night, undisturbed by these judgments, having long ago ceased seeking validation from those who cannot distinguish truth from fashionable fantasy. My speech emerges from direct perception rather than calculation about reception. This is not rudeness. I do not seek to provoke or disturb. I simply state what I observe to be true without the elaborate hedging that approval seekers employ. Notice their verbal tics. I might be wrong, but this is just my opinion. I don't mean to offend, but each phrase signals internal calculation, the attempt to preserve approval while speaking. The liberated person states directly, "This is so," or "I observe thus." He neither apologizes for his perception nor demands that others share it. When disagreement arises, he maintains his position or acknowledges different perspectives exist, but without needing to convert the other or restore their approval through retreat. This requires genuine indifference to their agreement, not feigned indifference, masking desperation, which others perceive immediately. True liberation manifests as actual lack of stake in whether they concur. You have stated your perception. They have stated theirs. Reality will determine which corresponds to truth. The liberated person also exercises the freedom to remain silent. The approval seeker feels compelled to fill silence with agreeable platitudes, to constantly demonstrate his pleasant nature through verbal accommodation. Liberation includes recognizing you need not speak unless you have something worth saying. This selective speech, when exercised, carries more weight than constant accommodation ever could. Practice this direct speech initially in safe context. State your genuine disagreement simply, "I see it differently," or "That contradicts my observation," without elaborate justification or apologetic framing. You will discover that disagreement rarely produces the catastrophe you imagine. Others may disagree in return, but disagreement is not disaster. It is simply two different perspectives encountering each other. Creative and intellectual work reveals the starkest distinction between enslaved and liberated consciousness. The approval seeker produces work designed to please calculating what audiences desire, what critics will praise, what secures professional advancement. This guarantees mediocrity because genuine innovation always disturbs prevailing comfort. I watched a gifted poet suppress his authentic verses, which challenged conventional romantic sentimentality with brutal honesty to produce palatable work that secured publication and modest reputation. On his deathbed, he confessed profound regret. He had prostituted his gift for approval that now seemed worthless. His successful poems would be forgotten within a generation, while the authentic verses he had hidden might have endured. He traded potential immortality for temporary approval, the worst bargain imaginable. When I completed my magnum opus, The World as Will and Representation, I knew it contained truths contemporaries were unprepared to hear. I published it anyway. For 30 years, it met with almost complete indifference. Not a review of significance, not an academic appointment, not recognition of any kind. Yet I never doubted its value or attempted to rewrite it for prevailing tastes. Why? Because the work's quality existed independently of temporal reception. Either my philosophy accurately described reality's fundamental nature, or it did not social approval, had no bearing on this question. I wrote for posterity, not for contemporaries. I served truth, not fashion. Consider your own work, whatever its nature. Ask yourself, honestly, would I pursue this if guaranteed no one would ever see it, approve it, or reward it? If the answer is no, you serve approval. Rather than truth, genuine work emerges from intrinsic necessity, not external validation. The professional paradox. Work produced without approval seeking often eventually receives recognition precisely because of its authenticity and depth. Work produced to please rarely endures because it lacks substance beneath appealing surface. My 3 decades of indifference eventually gave way to recognition when minds capable of grasping my philosophy appeared. Had I accommodated prevailing tastes, I would have produced work that pleased contemporaries but offered nothing of lasting value. Liberation thus proves practically advantageous even in purely careerist terms, though this should emphatically not be your motivation. Pursue authentic work because it is authentic, not because you believe authenticity will eventually be rewarded. Sometimes it is. Often it is not. Either way, you will have produced something of genuine value rather than ephemeral fashion. Quality inversely correlates with approval seeking in creative work. The more you calculate what will please, the less originality and depth you achieve. The more you pursue authentic vision, regardless of reception, the greater your chance of creating something genuinely significant recognized in your lifetime, or posthumously matters less than the work's intrinsic quality. Intimate relationships reveal approval seeking's deepest operations because here the stakes seem highest. Family bonds, marriage, friendship apparently depend on pleasing the other. Yet precisely here liberation proves most necessary and most valuable. I observed a Frankfurt couple society, lauded as exemplary marriage. The wife had extinguished every independent thought and interest to reflect her husband's preferences with perfect accuracy. Society praised her selfless devotion. I saw annihilation. Years later, after her husband's death, she discovered she possessed no self, remaining no preferences, no interests, no personality, independent of the man she had served. She had sacrificed existence itself for approval that ended with his death. Meanwhile, another couple I knew maintained separate identities and interests, disagreed openly, respected each other's autonomy. Society deemed them contentious and poorly matched. They alone sustained genuine partnership, 2 actual individuals in authentic relationship rather than one person plus one reflection. The relationship based on perpetual self-suppression serves neither party. It creates not intimacy but performance, not love but mutual exploitation. Genuine intimacy requires 2 authentic individuals willing to encounter each other truthfully. This necessarily generates conflict at times. The question is whether you prefer false harmony through self-betrayal or authentic relationship that tolerates disagreement. When I was 26, my mother Johanna demanded I abandon philosophical pursuits to ornament her Weimar salon as dutiful, socially accomplished. Son, I refused absolutely. She insisted. I maintained my position. We broke relations permanently. I lost a mother. I gained intellectual freedom. Only you can determine which matters more. But understand clearly, you cannot have both when they conflict. Establish boundaries lines where you will not sacrifice your nature regardless of the other's disapproval. These boundaries prove not barriers to intimacy, but prerequisites for it. Without them, you have merger but not relationship, which eventually generates resentment rather than love. Liberation may lead to solitude, possibly permanent. I have lived alone in my Frankfurt apartment for 3 decades now, with only my poodle Atma for daily companionship. Society pities such solitude. I often pity those trapped in relationships requiring perpetual self-betrayal to maintain ceasing people-pleasing winnows relationships. Those based on your pleasing facade dissolve. Those capable of tolerating authenticity strengthen. This proves ultimately valuable, better few genuine connections than many false ones. The relationship that cannot survive your authentic expression was already false, destined either to suffocate you or eventually collapse from accumulated resentment. In your closest relationships, identify one area where you consistently suppress authentic response to please the other. Express your genuine view there, once not aggressively, simply truthfully. Usually, the relationship proves more resilient than you feared, and relief of authenticity outweighs any discomfort. Ceasing to seek approval represents not merely behavioral modification or psychological adjustment, but fundamental transformation of consciousness's relationship to the will itself. This is the deepest teaching, withheld until you possess sufficient preparation to receive it. Standing at dawn at my Frankfurt apartment threshold, watching the city awaken, I once experienced a moment of clarity that altered everything. All the individuals rushing to their obligations, the clerks, the merchants, the servants, I recognized as temporary objectifications of the same, will that manifest as me? In that moment, the question, do they approve of me, became literally meaningless, like asking whether one ocean wave approves of another. This was not intellectual understanding, but direct perception. Consciousness glimpsed its own operations from outside the will's complete dominance. The boundaries between self and other became transparently thin, revealing the single will manifesting through countless temporary forms. You are not identical with your thoughts, emotions, or the will-driven impulses that arise in consciousness. You can observe these operations, which means you cannot be reducible to them. Cultivate this witness consciousness, the awareness that perceives awareness itself. This creates crucial distance from approval-seeking compulsions. When you observe there is anxiety about tomorrow's meeting, rather than identifying as I am anxious, when you notice there is desire for approval rather than experiencing I need approval, a subtle but profound shift occurs. You recognize that the approval-seeking mechanism operates within consciousness without being consciousness itself. Complete escape from will proves impossible while you remain embodied in phenomenal existence. But the grip can loosen sufficiently that you operate with genuine freedom. You still experience desires, including occasional approval-seeking, but you perceive them as will's operations, rather than identifying with them completely as your desires requiring satisfaction. This liberation never completes permanently in most individuals. I make no claim to have achieved it myself. The will constantly reasserts dominance. Old patterns return. Yet each cycle of recognition and relapse deepens understanding, until eventually, in rare cases, the denial of will becomes sufficiently complete that approval-seeking substantially ceases. Develop daily practice of observing consciousness itself. Spend 10 minutes each morning simply watching thoughts, emotions, and impulses arise without identifying with them. Over months, this creates experiential understanding that you are not identical with the approval-seeking mechanism, you are the awareness within which it operates. This gap between the compulsion and your response to it constitutes genuine freedom, not absence of compulsion, but conscious relationship to it. You still feel the pull toward approval-seeking, but you perceive it as one possible response among others rather than inevitable necessity. This path leads not to happiness in any conventional sense, not to social success, harmonious relationships, or comfortable existence. It leads to something I consider more valuable. Clear sight of reality without delusion, truthful existence without self-deception, the dignity of perceiving existence's actual nature, however harsh that perception. My decades of public indifference represented one form of suffering, the isolation of being unrecognized, the financial constraints of independent scholarship, the absence of professional validation. Yet I never doubted I had chosen correctly by refusing to accommodate my philosophy to prevailing tastes for approval's sake. The university scholars who compromised truth for career advancement suffered differently. The slow death of integrity, the hollowness of praise for work they knew was dishonest, the final recognition at life's end that they had wasted their intellectual gifts serving approval rather than truth. Between these two forms of suffering, which would you choose? The man who ceases pleasing everyone exchanges the torment of endless approval-seeking for the loneliness of existing according to truth. Both are forms of suffering, the will ensures this. But the latter carries dignity, the former lacks. It is the suffering of clear sight rather than blind stumbling, the pain of the physician who recognizes disease rather than the patient who mistakes symptoms for health. I offer no false comfort. This transformation will not make you popular, successful, or conventionally happy. You will likely be more isolated, more frequently disappointed in humanity, more aware of uncomfortable truths others ignore. Accept this clearly-eyed rather than pursuing liberation with unrealistic expectations. Yet paradoxically, though this path should not be pursued for practical advantage, it often produces better outcomes than approval-seeking. Authentic work proves more durable. Authentic speech generates respect even when generating disagreement. Authentic relationships, though fewer, prove more nourishing. But these advantages must remain byproducts, not motivations. When you encounter the difficult moments this path inevitably brings, when authenticity costs you approval, when truth-speaking generates isolation, when refusing to please creates conflict, return to this recognition. I have chosen clear sight over comfortable delusion, dignity over desperate neediness. This discomfort is the price of truthful existence. This is not rationalization, but conscious choice repeatedly affirmed. The path becomes sustainable when you genuinely prefer difficult truth to comfortable lies, rather than pursuing truth while secretly hoping it will prove comfortable. Not all suffering is equal. Between the suffering of clear sight and the suffering of delusion, choose the former if you possess intellectual courage. Between the loneliness of truthful existence and the crowded isolation of perpetual performance, choose truth if you value your nature more than others' approval. You stand now where you stood at the beginning, but stand there with eyes open. The crossroads remains, continued enslavement to approval-seeking or progressive movement toward liberation. But you now perceive both paths clearly, their costs, their rewards, their ultimate implications. After 60 years of philosophical work, my final recognition: I remain subject to will's operations even as I perceive and describe them. I still feel academic rejection sting occasionally. I still harbor residual resentment toward those who ignored my work for decades. Complete liberation eludes me. Yet I have loosened the grip sufficiently to pursue truth regardless of consequence, to write what I perceive as true, whether any reader applauds or condemns it. This partial liberation suffices for genuine philosophical work and for existence I deem worthwhile. The goal is not perfection, but progressive liberation, not escape from will, but conscious relationship to its operations. You will repeatedly fall back into approval-seeking patterns despite your understanding. This is not failure, but natural oscillation between will-dominated and witness consciousness. The task is not to never fall, but to recognize when you have fallen and consciously return to liberation's practice. How do I live without seeking approval? Proves more valuable as living question than as answered problem. Keep this question alive. This ongoing inquiry sustains transformation better than any fixed answer or achieved state. You need not achieve perfect liberation to live a worthwhile existence. Sufficient loosening of will's grip enables pursuit of truth, authentic relationships, meaningful work. Do not let perfect liberation's difficulty prevent you from pursuing partial liberation's genuine value. Establish daily practice of conscious reorientation. Each morning, briefly acknowledge, today I will orient toward truth rather than toward approval. I will fail at times. I will notice and return to orientation. This is not rigid discipline, but gentle, persistent redirection. When you catch yourself people-pleasing, simply notice without harsh self-judgment and make different choice in next moment. Over months and years, this patient practice transforms your general orientation, even as specific failures continue. The question is not, am I perfectly liberated, but am I oriented toward liberation or toward continued enslavement? Liberation is ongoing practice rather than achieved destination. This recognition, paradoxically, liberates from anxiety of never feeling liberated enough. You orient your existence toward truth, fail regularly, return to orientation, succeed occasionally, deepen understanding progressively. This proves sufficient not for perfect freedom from approval seeking, but for existence oriented toward truth rather than validation. You discover what I have discovered. This imperfect liberation suffices for genuine work, authentic relationships, and existence that touches something beyond the blind striving characterizing most human life. You cannot unknow what you have understood here. The recognition of bondage marks the beginning of possible freedom. Whether you choose to test the prison bar's strength lies beyond my power to determine. I return to my work, my solitary walks along Frankfurt streets, my evening contemplation, my philosophical writing. I please no one but truth, and truth itself cares nothing for my service. Yet this seems to me the only life worth living, the only life that touches, however briefly, something beyond the blind striving that constitutes existence. Make of this what you will.